He survived the crash and ended up on a deserted island, believing that one day he would be rescued. But one day, a storm revealed what had been hidden underground all this time, an old metal hatch leading to a secret bunker. What he saw inside changed everything forever. Subscribe to the channel and make sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The morning sun burned like molten glass above the Caribbean horizon as Carter Matthews tightened the straps of his worn leather flight harness. The small twin prop hummed beneath him, alive, vibrating with the steady rhythm of the pistons. The airstrip outside Cartagena shimmered with heat, and the smell of fuel mixed with salt air drifted through the open hangar doors. It was a routine day, a routine flight. Panama to Nassau, a short hop carrying a few sealed crates and some corporate documents. But routine was never something Carter truly believed in. Not after the years he had spent watching weather change without reason, engines fail without cause, and people vanish from radar screens as if the ocean swallowed them whole. He was a man built by the air itself, tall, steady, with eyes that had seen too many sunrises above cloud layers and too few promises kept below them. At 37, his body still bore the discipline of the military. Measured movements, deliberate gestures, breath synchronized with purpose. Yet there was a heaviness inside him, something older than exhaustion, a persistent ache left by absence. His father, also a pilot, had disappeared over the Caribbean in 1987 during what the Air Force had called a routine navigation exercise. No wreckage was ever found, no radio signal ever recovered. The only thing that returned was his flight badge, mailed to their home in Miami in an unmarked envelope 6 months later. Since then, Carter had spent his entire adult life chasing skies that looked like the one his father vanished into. He moved with mechanical precision through the pre-flight checks, his hands running over instruments, fuel valves, and control cables. Oil pressure, normal. Alternator, stable. Flaps, 30 degrees. His co-pilot's seat was empty. Most of his charters were solo these days. It gave him room to think and space to breathe the ghosts that followed him. He paused for a moment, glancing at the old photograph clipped to the dashboard, a black and white shot of his father beside a C-47, smiling under the sun. The resemblance was uncanny. Same shoulders, same calm determination in the eyes. He flipped the photo down and exhaled slowly. Routine flight, no complications. The radio crackled faintly as he requested takeoff clearance. The tower's response came muffled but clear. Wind direction steady, visibility fair, no traffic ahead. He guided the aircraft down the narrow strip, the wheels bumping lightly before lifting free of the earth. The sensation of rising always brought him a brief peace. The land fell away, and the vast, endless expanse of sea opened beneath him, a living mirror reflecting the clouds. For the first 2 hours, the flight went perfectly. He kept the throttle steady, checked the instruments every few minutes, and tuned into the usual chatter of pilots exchanging coordinates and weather updates. But as he crossed the southern edge of the Caribbean corridor, just beyond San Andres, the first irregularity appeared. The compass needle trembled, not dramatically, just a subtle shiver that made him glance twice. Then the GPS screen flickered, coordinates blinking in and out like an old neon sign. He frowned, tapped the display, and it steadied. A static whisper filled the radio, then silence. He adjusted the frequency, assuming it was a regional interference from a nearby storm system. Nothing alarming yet. The sky began to change by degrees. The horizon turned a washed-out silver, the kind of light that strips away all sense of distance. Ahead, thin curtains of cloud drifted low, and his altimeter wavered between readings. He climbed slightly to stay above the haze. It wasn't until he noticed the transponder light dimming, just a soft pulse losing rhythm, that his chest tightened. He checked the circuit breakers, found nothing wrong. The electrical system hummed fine, yet the signal on the screen faded, like a heartbeat growing weaker. Then it went out entirely. He told himself it was nothing, a malfunction in the transponder's relay. He had seen worse. He took a deep breath, reached for the backup unit, and kept his heading steady. But then the engine coughed, a hollow, dry sound that snapped through the cabin. The propeller sputtered once, caught again, then faltered a second time. His pulse spiked. He scanned the gauges. Fuel pressure normal, oil temperature steady, intake clear. The engine had no reason to fail. And yet it did. The right propeller slowed, the vibration uneven. Carter's training took over. Mixture, full rich, fuel selector both, magnetos on. The motor responded for a moment, surging, then dropped again into silence. The only sound left was wind and the faint metallic creak of the fuselage under strain. He tried to broadcast a mayday, but the radio emitted only a static hiss. No signal. He was invisible to every radar and every ear. He leaned forward, scanning the ocean below for any sign of land. Then, as if summoned, he saw it, a small patch of green breaking through the gray-blue surface of the sea. It wasn't marked on his charts, not on any of the maps he carried, barely a kilometer wide, shaped like a crescent, bordered by dark cliffs on one side and shallow beaches on the other. A perfect emergency landing zone if he could make it. The wind shifted violently. The aircraft dropped 50 feet in a sudden downdraft. Carter's hands gripped the yoke tight. He trimmed the elevators, angled the nose upward just enough to level out. The island drew closer. He could see waves crashing against black rock, sprays of white foam exploding like fireworks. He had seconds to choose: open water or the narrow strip of trees that bordered the beach. Water meant near certain drowning. Trees meant broken bones, maybe worse. He aimed for the trees. The ground came fast. Leaves, branches, the glint of wet sand, and then impact, an eruption of sound and motion. The left wing clipped a palm trunk, the plane spun, metal screamed, glass shattered. Carter's head slammed against the harness. The world fractured into flashes of green and white and noise. When the movement stopped, there was silence. Only the distant roar of surf filled the void. Pain registered slowly. A deep ache in his ribs, a cut along his forehead. Blood trickled into his eye. He unbuckled, gasping, and stumbled out of the cockpit into humid air thick with salt and smoke. The fuselage was torn open, one wing buried in sand. Flames licked at the engine casing, but the damp breeze stifled them quickly. He dragged out the emergency kit, the radio pack, and what little water he had. His hands shook, not from fear but from adrenaline. He was alive, against all odds, alive. He looked around, trying to orient himself. The island was silent. No birds, no voices, just the whisper of wind through mangroves. He could smell something metallic in the air, almost like ozone after a lightning strike. The beach stretched both ways until it disappeared behind rocky outcroppings. Behind him, dense vegetation rose into low hills crowned with dark stone. He squinted against the sunlight reflecting off something embedded in the sand a few meters away. Kneeling, he brushed it clean. It was a fragment of metal, curved and polished, with letters faintly engraved, Argus. The same word he had once seen scribbled on the corner of his father's service records, a classification stamp that no one in the Air Force archives could explain. He stood motionless for a long time, the fragment cold in his hand. Then he turned it over. On the back was a sequence of numbers arranged like coordinates, though incomplete, missing digits at the end as if deliberately erased. His heartbeat quickened. Coincidence, he tried to tell himself. But coincidences had a strange way of circling him like birds waiting for the storm. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening across the beach. He built a crude shelter using pieces of the wing and palm fronds, setting a small fire near the wreck to keep animals or ghosts away. As the flames flickered, the light caught the metal fragment again, throwing a sharp reflection onto the nearby rocks. For an instant, he thought he saw movement in that glint, as if the reflection bounced off another metallic surface hidden higher in the cliffs. He narrowed his eyes. Nothing. Only stone. But when he listened carefully, he could swear he heard something faint beyond the waves, a hum, low and rhythmic, like a machine buried deep under earth and time. Carter lay awake that night, staring at the sky through the gaps in the shelter. The stars above the Caribbean usually pulsed bright and clean, but here they seemed distorted, blurred around the edges. The constellations themselves felt wrong, displaced by a few degrees. He wondered if it was his concussion, or if this island simply lived beneath a different kind of sky. Sleep came in fragments. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of his father's plane diving through clouds, silver against a blinding sun. He heard static, the same hiss now living in his radio, and then silence. When he woke, dawn had painted the sea in shades of copper. The wreck lay still, the sand around it littered with twisted aluminum and glass. He walked to the shore and dipped his hands in the water. It was warm, unnaturally warm, like a tide heated from below. He looked inland toward the ridge of black rock rising above the tree line. Something shimmered faintly at its base, half buried in moss. As he began to climb toward it, the wind shifted again, carrying with it a scent unlike salt or seaweed, something sterile, chemical, almost electric. The closer he got, the stronger it became. His boots slid against slick stone as he reached the base of the cliff. And there, under layers of mineral crust, he saw it. A perfectly straight edge cutting across the rock, a seam that nature could never create. He ran his fingers along it. The surface was smooth metal disguised under paint textured to mimic stone. He stepped back, staring at it as waves thundered behind him. Somewhere deep inside, he knew what this meant. The island wasn't what it seemed. He had not crashed by accident. Something, someone, had guided him here, and whatever waited behind that sealed line in the rock had been waiting for a very long time. As the sun climbed higher, the air shimmered with heat and mystery. Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked again at the fragment marked Argus. The engraved numbers caught the light, pointing not to an answer but to the beginning of a descent he could no longer avoid. The island was quiet, but in that quiet he could sense a hum beneath the earth, steady and patient, as though the island itself was breathing. And far out over the silver horizon, the clouds gathered once more, silent witnesses to a man who had just stepped into the void his father had vanished into decades ago. The first morning after the crash arrived heavy and quiet, with a kind of silence that seemed to press down from the clouds. Carter woke before sunrise, his back sore from the makeshift shelter he had built out of broken fuselage pieces and palm leaves. The air smelled of salt and iron. Smoke from the small fire he had kept alive through the night hung in a thin column that vanished into the still dawn. He sat up slowly, wincing as the bruises along his ribs reminded him of the violence that had brought him here. The wrecked plane stood half buried in the sand, the tail twisted toward the sea as if still trying to take flight. He checked his supplies with the calm precision of habit. Half a bottle of water, a small ration pack, the medical kit, a knife, and a flare gun. The emergency radio refused to respond, the signal light dim as a dying ember. He pressed the button anyway, hearing only static. No one out there was listening. He turned the dial through the frequencies one after another, but the silence was absolute. It was as if the air itself swallowed sound. He needed to move. Staying close to the crash might make him visible from above, but after the way his instruments had failed, he wasn't sure anyone would ever fly near this place again. He slung his pack over his shoulder and began walking along the beach. The sand was white, almost too white, soft underfoot but scattered with small fragments of something that glittered faintly in the morning light. When he bent to look closer, he realized they weren't shells but bits of glass, tiny, uniform, like shattered lenses. He rubbed one between his fingers. It felt smooth, polished, artificial. The beach curved around the island's perimeter, broken by jagged black stones that jutted from the surf like teeth. Beyond them lay a dense wall of vegetation, trees with waxy leaves and tangled roots that seemed to grip the ground with desperate strength. The forest pulsed with humidity. Cicadas buzzed somewhere unseen, and every few steps he caught glimpses of small, quick movements among the branches. The place was alive, but unnaturally ordered. Trees of different species stood at regular intervals, as though planted rather than grown. He stopped several times to mark his route with small piles of stones, but when he turned back minutes later, the markers were gone, scattered by nothing he could hear or see. He found the stream just before noon, its water clear, running cold between smooth stones. Kneeling, he drank greedily, the taste crisp but with a faint metallic trace. He followed it upstream until it narrowed into a shallow bed near the island's center. From there, the terrain rose into low hills covered in fern and vine. The heat grew thicker, wrapping around him like wet cloth. He could feel it vibrating from the ground itself, not from the sun above, but from something deeper. He reached a small plateau that overlooked the northern cliffs. From there, he could see almost the entire island, its crescent shape, the white beaches on the south side, the dark rock wall on the north. The forest filled the interior like a carpet of green velvet. No smoke, no buildings, no movement beyond the restless shimmer of heat. The world beyond was endless blue. For a long moment, he just stood there, the wind pressing against his clothes, the hum in his ears deepening. He spent the next hours methodically exploring, his mind returning always to the fragment he had found, the metal plate with the word Argus. He couldn't shake the sense that the name was important. He remembered finding it once before, hidden in his father's declassified documents. It had been stamped on a torn corner of a report marked restricted. At the time, he'd thought it was the name of a radar project or maybe an aircraft system. But now, with that same word lying on an uncharted island beneath a broken sky, it carried a different weight, something ancient and deliberate. By late afternoon, he returned to the beach, gathering driftwood to reinforce his shelter. The light had shifted into a harsh, metallic tone, the horizon blurring where sea met sky. He stopped to study the wreck again. The wings were mangled, the fuselage buckled in the center, but part of the cockpit still clung to life. He climbed inside and checked the instruments once more. Dead. Every gauge flat, every circuit lifeless. The radio emitted a faint hum now. No signal, but not complete silence either, like a frequency hovering just out of reach. He tapped the casing and froze. For a moment, the light flickered back on. A single flash, one brief heartbeat of power. Then darkness again. He spent the night reinforcing his shelter and building a larger fire. He thought about writing a message in the sand, but the tide was unpredictable. It rose fast, erasing every mark he made. Around midnight, as the flames burned low, he heard a sound that froze his breath, a low, mechanical whine, faint but steady, coming from the direction of the northern cliffs. He stood completely still, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, pulsing, as if some enormous generator were buried beneath the stone. He waited for it to fade, but it didn't. It went on for several minutes, then stopped all at once, leaving a silence that felt even heavier. The next day, he decided to move inland, toward the cliffs. He followed the sound's memory, weaving through the dense forest. Every step brought a new discovery, small anomalies that prickled his nerves. He found the remains of a fire pit, old but not ancient, the ashes protected from rain by a careful ring of stones. Nearby, half buried in soil, lay a military-style canteen, clean and intact, stamped with a manufacture date only a few years old. Further on, a row of trees stood evenly spaced, each marked with shallow notches near their bases, lines carved with precision, forming what looked like coordinates when read together. Someone had been here, and recently. Carter's thoughts returned to the idea of control. During his years in the service, he had seen islands like this, remote testing sites, experimental stations, forgotten installations left behind by governments that no longer wanted to admit their existence. But those places were usually stripped bare when abandoned. This island, in contrast, seemed tended. The air was too clean, the vegetation too uniform, the very silence engineered. When he reached the base of the cliffs, the sense of design grew stronger. The rock here was a deep, volcanic gray streaked with mineral veins, and the surface felt unnaturally smooth in places, almost polished. He traced his fingers along the stone and found straight lines hidden beneath the growth of moss, edges and corners that did not belong in geology. He began scraping at one with a piece of coral, clearing away the damp layer until the metal underneath gleamed faintly. The seam stretched at least 10 feet across, vanishing into shadow on both sides. He spent hours examining it, convinced that it was part of a larger structure buried within the cliff. The sound he had heard last night might have come from inside. He tested the surface with his knife. The blade left no mark. It was steel, or something stronger. At one point, he pressed his ear to it and thought he could hear a deep vibration, a slow pulse like the breath of a sleeping giant. He marked the spot carefully and returned to the beach before dark. On the way back, he found another anomaly, a stretch of ground where the undergrowth had been cleared in a perfect circle about 20 feet wide. In the center lay a single black stone, flat and smooth, inscribed with faint geometric patterns. He knelt beside it, tracing the symbols with his fingertip. They were worn, almost invisible, but one shape stood out, a triangle within a circle, the same design he had seen stamped on the old Air Force badges his father used to wear. That night, a storm rolled in from the horizon. The first lightning flashed far out to sea, but the thunder that followed felt close, crawling across the island like a living thing. Carter secured his shelter and waited, watching the dark sky pulse with light. For a moment, he thought he saw shapes moving among the trees, illuminated by the brief strobe of lightning, tall, thin silhouettes that vanished before he could focus. The wind rose, tearing through the palms, and the rain came like sheets of glass. He spent hours listening to the storm, each gust of wind carrying echoes of that same mechanical hum he had heard before. At one point, half asleep, he thought he heard something else beneath the thunder, a metallic groan deep within the earth. It might have been imagination, or it might have been the island exhaling. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The world smelled washed and new. The storm had stripped away layers of sand from the base of the northern cliffs, revealing more of the hidden structure beneath. From a distance, it looked like the corner of a massive door, now exposed by erosion. He could see faint lines running outward from it, like the edges of panels fitted seamlessly together. He approached cautiously. The sun glinted on the wet metal, making it almost blinding. When he touched it, it felt cold, not the coolness of shade, but a deep internal cold, as if the metal came from a place that had never known sunlight. There was no handle, no visible entry, only a small indentation near the center filled with water and debris. He cleaned it out and found something resembling a keyhole or sensor socket, circular, the size of a coin. His instincts told him to stay back, to mark it and return later, but curiosity overrode fear. He examined the edges again, following them as they disappeared into the rock. It was a door. There was no doubt now. Someone had built this place to last, to hide, and they had done it long ago. He sat back on his heels, staring at it while the waves crashed behind him. The day stretched into afternoon as he tried to make sense of what he had found. He built another fire, this one closer to the cliffs, and roasted small fish he had caught near the lagoon. The act of eating steadied him, grounding him in something human. Yet every time he glanced toward the cliffs, he could feel the weight of that door pressing against his thoughts. The Argus fragment in his pocket felt heavier than ever. As night approached, he noticed something strange near the waterline. A line of debris, wood, shells, seaweed, had washed ashore as usual, but within it were objects that didn't belong. Pieces of plastic packaging marked with dates from recent years, fragments of a metal container stamped "Property of U.S. Government," and a small flashlight whose bulb still faintly glowed when he pressed the switch. These weren't relics from the past, they were signs of ongoing presence. Someone, somewhere, was still maintaining something connected to this place. He built a larger signal fire that evening, hoping against reason that a passing aircraft might see it. The flames rose high, painting his face orange in the dark. The stars were visible again, sharp and cold, but as he looked up, he noticed one star moving, slowly, deliberately, across the sky, then stopping. A satellite, perhaps, or a plane. But when he turned his head to grab the flare gun and looked back, it was gone. He didn't sleep much that night. The wind carried whispers through the trees, not voices exactly, but patterns of sound that felt too deliberate to be random. When he finally drifted off near dawn, he dreamed of the door again, the seam in the cliff opening soundlessly to reveal a corridor of red light and the echo of footsteps descending into the earth. When he awoke, sweat covered his skin, though the air was cool. The fire had burned to ash, the tide had come and gone, and in the sand near his shelter, fresh footprints led toward the cliffs. They were large, deep, made by boots, not bare feet. He followed them halfway down the beach before they vanished abruptly, as if the person who left them had stepped straight into the rock. Carter stood there for a long time, staring at that impossible end. Then, slowly, he turned his eyes toward the cliffs, to the seam of metal now shining in the morning light. The island was no longer a place of survival. It was a trap, constructed long before he arrived, and waiting, it seemed, just for him. For 3 days, Carter circled the northern cliffs, studying every crack and seam in the dark volcanic wall. The metallic line he had uncovered glared at him each morning when the sun rose from the sea. It had become both a promise and a warning, an invitation to a truth he was no longer sure he wanted. He scavenged the wreck for tools, stripping out panels of aluminum, cutting wires, and fashioning a crude lever from part of the landing gear strut. His training had taught him that the smallest mechanical weakness could open the most impossible barriers, but as he worked, a deeper voice in him whispered that this door was not meant to be opened by accident. The days passed heavy with humidity, and the sky never seemed to clear. The air had that charged stillness that came before a storm, though no wind ever reached the island. He marked the passage of time by the slow decay of the wreck and the rhythm of the tides, but both began to feel unreliable. The nights were worse. He would wake suddenly, convinced he had heard footsteps moving in the sand beyond the dying fire, but when he crawled out of his shelter, there was only the sea whispering against the shore. The footprints he had found days before still haunted him. No tide had erased them, and no new ones had appeared. They ended at the same place, near the seam of the hidden door. On the morning of the fourth day, he decided to act. Waiting had turned into paralysis. If there was an explanation buried behind that steel, he would find it, or die trying. He packed what little he had: the knife, a piece of rope, 2 water bottles, and the flashlight he had salvaged from the debris that had washed ashore. Its dim beam flickered but held. He took a last look at the sea before turning toward the cliffs. The door stood silent, its outline clearer now that he had cleared away the moss and sand. From a distance, it could still pass as part of the rock, but up close the illusion failed. The edges were too straight, the surface too smooth. He ran his hand along it and felt a faint vibration under his palm, like the tremor of an idle engine. He hesitated, then wedged the makeshift lever into the small indentation he had found earlier. The first attempt produced only a dull thud. The second time the sound changed, a metallic groan, low and resonant. He pushed harder, muscles straining, until something deep within the structure clicked. Air hissed through a narrow crack, carrying with it a smell of rust and chemicals. He stepped back as the seam widened, dust and debris cascading down in a soft cloud. The door moved only a few inches, then stopped. He pulled the lever free and slipped his fingers into the gap. Cold metal met his skin. With all his strength, he pushed. The door yielded slowly, inch by inch, until a sliver of darkness opened before him. A wave of air escaped, dry, artificial, tinged with ozone. It smelled like a place sealed for decades. He hesitated at the threshold. The darkness beyond was absolute. The beam of his flashlight trembled across the opening, catching the faint outline of a corridor descending into the earth. The walls were metal, riveted panels stained with age. On the floor, a thin layer of dust lay undisturbed except for a set of footprints that vanished into the black. They were old, maybe years old, maybe days. There was no way to tell. Carter's heart pounded as he stepped through. The door shut behind him with a soft but final sound, sealing out the world of sunlight and surf. For a moment, panic clawed at him. The air was heavy, and each breath felt like drawing in the weight of time itself. He steadied himself and moved forward, one cautious step at a time. The corridor sloped downward gently, the floor covered in fine sand carried in by the wind, or perhaps by the ghosts of storms. As he walked, the flashlight beam caught the glint of metal plaques fixed at regular intervals along the wall. The first read, Level 1, Entry. The next, Authorized Personnel Only. The English words looked strange here, like fossils from another century. After 20 meters, he reached a junction. To the right, a heavy blast door remained sealed. To the left, a smaller doorway stood half open, its hinges stiff but intact. He pushed it aside and entered. The room beyond was square, about the size of a small office. Shelves lined the walls, filled with metal containers labeled in faded stencil, food supply, water purification, battery cells. On one of the shelves, a box lay open, revealing rows of canned goods that looked newer than they should have. He picked one up, brushed away the dust, and froze. The expiration date was 2025. He put the can down carefully. That wasn't possible. His crash had happened in 2023. Someone had been here, restocking, maintaining. This place was not abandoned. At the center of the room stood a metal table with objects neatly arranged on top. Maps printed on yellow and paper, an old radio unit, a stack of weather reports from the late 1960s. Among them lay a single binder wrapped in plastic. The cover bore the same word he had seen on the fragment of metal: Project Argus. His throat tightened. He unsealed it slowly. Inside were pages typed in English and Spanish, some stamped Confidential, U.S. Department of Defense. The first document was dated 1967. It described the establishment of a remote psychological observation facility for long-term environmental isolation studies. The coordinates listed corresponded roughly to this part of the Caribbean. A paragraph at the bottom mentioned joint oversight by the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Navy. The text blurred before his eyes. He turned the page. There were diagrams of underground structures, supply routes, communication relays, even psychological protocols for extended sensory deprivation. One line caught his eye. Subject profiles to be drawn from military personnel with strong resilience indices and familial motivation anchors. He reread the words slowly, his pulse quickening. Familial motivation anchors, those were the very traits his father's records had emphasized. He kept reading, flipping through the pages as if tearing through layers of a dream. Some of the documents were newer, typed in modern fonts, listing maintenance schedules from the early 2000s, personnel rotations, funded under different corporate names. The same project, alive under new disguises. He turned to leave, but stopped. On the far wall, partially hidden by shadows, hung a photograph. The frame was rusted, the glass cracked, but the image inside was clear. It showed a group of men in military uniforms standing in front of what looked like this very facility. At the center of the group was a tall man with dark skin, smiling slightly, his hand resting on a pilot's helmet. Carter felt his stomach drop. The man was his father. The shock rooted him to the floor. His breath came shallow, his heartbeat thundered in his ears. The date scrawled on the back of the photo read October 1968. His father would have been barely 20 then, too young for the uniform he wore. He reached out to touch the image, tracing the familiar outline of the man's face. The skin under his fingers was cold glass, but the memory that surfaced was warm. His father lifting him as a child, laughing in the sunlight. Now that memory warped, twisted into something tainted. His father hadn't simply disappeared. He had been part of this place. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table for support. The truth was too large to fit inside his thoughts. He forced himself to breathe, to think. If his father had been here, if he had helped build or operate this facility, then perhaps the disappearance wasn't an accident at all. Perhaps the crash that had brought Carter here wasn't either. The thought crawled through him like ice. He left the room and continued deeper into the corridor. His flashlight flickered, then steadied again. The air temperature dropped the further he went. On the right, another doorway opened into a wider chamber. He stepped inside and froze. It was a laboratory, preserved as if time had forgotten it. Tables lined with instruments from another era, oscilloscopes, reels of tape, microscopes yellowed with age. Glass jars filled with chemical residue glimmered under the thin layer of dust. On one wall hung a large chalkboard covered with faded writing. Formulas, brainwave graphs, and phrases like cognitive resilience and behavioral degradation threshold. In the corner stood a rack of old recording devices, their reels labeled by date. The earliest read 1970. The latest, astonishingly, read 2022. He pressed the power switch on one of the newer units. It hummed to life instantly. The red light glowed steady. He hadn't seen a functioning piece of equipment in days, yet this one responded as if it had been waiting. He found a speaker attached by a brittle wire and turned the dial. A soft click echoed, followed by the faint hiss of static. Then, faintly, a voice. It was distorted, genderless, but unmistakably human. The recording looped a short message. Level 1 secured. Subject 9 parameters stable. Observation continues. The words repeated, then the machine clicked off. Subject 9. He stood still, the air suddenly cold against his skin. The voice sounded recent, clear, unaged. He turned slowly toward the row of monitors on the opposite wall. They were dark, but as he approached, one of them blinked on with a soft whine. Lines of green code scrolled across the screen, followed by a message. System integrity. Active. Remote access established. Carter backed away. His reflection stared at him from the glass of the monitor, his face pale under the dim light. He was not alone here. Someone, or something, still controlled this place, still watched. He moved toward the exit, heart racing, every nerve alive. As he reached the corridor, the lights above him flickered, one after another, as though sensing his movement. A low hum filled the air, that same sound he had heard outside, but louder now, pulsing through the walls. He followed the corridor upward, desperate for daylight. When he reached the first junction, he stopped dead. The door through which he had entered was closing. Slowly, mechanically, the massive slab of steel slid back into place. He ran, the echo of his footsteps drowned by the grinding metal. He reached the gap just in time to wedge his shoulder into the narrowing space. With a final heave, he slipped through and fell onto the sand outside. The door sealed behind him with a dull thud, leaving only the faint seam to show it had ever been open. He lay there for a long time, chest heaving, staring at the indifferent sky. The sea was calm, as if nothing beneath the island had stirred. Yet the truth had shifted irreversibly. The name, Argus, was no longer a mystery from his father's past. It was the architecture of his own present. The facility under the cliffs was not a ruin, but a living system. And if it still functioned, if someone had restocked its supplies and kept its machines running, then whoever controlled it knew exactly that he was here. As night fell, he sat by his fire, the photograph of his father in his hands. The man's smile looked different now, secretive, knowing. Carter stared at the flames and felt the old boundaries of time dissolve. The island, the crash, his father's disappearance, each piece fit into a larger pattern that pulsed like the heartbeat he had felt behind that steel door. He realized then that he had crossed not just into the island's interior but into the past itself, and that whatever waited beneath those cliffs had already marked him long before his plane had ever taken off. Sleep became a fragile thing for Carter after that night. Each time his eyes closed, His mind dragged him back into the metal corridors beneath the cliffs. The hiss of the sealed air, the humming machines, the photograph of his father's younger face staring back at him from the wall of ghosts. When dawn arrived, he woke drenched in sweat, uncertain which parts had been dreams and which belonged to the waking world. The fire had gone out, leaving only gray ash. The door at the base of the cliffs looked exactly as before, its perfect seam catching the new light like a scar across the rock. But Carter knew better now. He had touched its heart. He had heard its breath, and somewhere beneath that steel, something still breathed in return. The next 2 days blurred into one long act of survival. He hunted along the shore, built a better shelter near the freshwater stream, and rationed his food carefully. Yet his thoughts returned again and again to the bunker. The documents, the photographs, the recordings, they were not remnants of an abandoned Cold War station. They were the bones of a system still alive. The discovery had changed the texture of the island. Every rustle of wind through the palms now sounded like footsteps. Every shadow that flickered along the rocks seemed to belong to someone watching. On the third morning, he awoke to find the wreck of his plane disturbed. The cockpit hatch he had left closed was open, and the footprints that led from it to the sand were the same size as his own, but deeper, heavier. He followed them only a few meters before they vanished again into the rocky ground. No sign of anyone else. No sound of departure. Only absence, perfectly orchestrated. He told himself he wouldn't return to the bunker, but the island left him no choice. Its silence had turned from indifferent to accusing. The hum beneath the cliffs pulsed like a heartbeat in his ears, always just below the threshold of sound. He could feel it when he walked barefoot across the sand, a faint vibration rising from the earth. On the 5th day, he gave in to it. He took his rope, his flashlight, and the same makeshift lever that had opened the door before. The metal was warm under his fingers this time, almost welcoming. When he pushed, the door yielded immediately, as if it had been expecting him. The corridor smelled the same, dust, old oil, and the faint sharpness of ozone, but the air was different. It moved, just barely, with the rhythmic pulse of a ventilation system. Somewhere down there, power still flowed. He descended slowly, marking the walls with small scratches from his knife so he could find his way back. The lights above flickered weakly, red emergency bulbs that had burned for decades. He passed the storage room again, the shelves untouched, the photo of his father watching silently from the wall. In the next corridor, he found a new door slightly ajar. The room beyond was larger, colder. Desks arranged in 2 neat rows faced a wall of dark screens. At the center stood a console with switches and a terminal screen that glowed with faint green light. He approached it cautiously, expecting another dead display, but text shimmered across the glass as he drew near. Lines of code, system readouts, and then a phrase that made his stomach turn: Argus Unit 9, active monitoring. He stared at the words until they blurred. Beneath them, a series of data fields updated in real time: heart rate, stress indicators, sleep cycles, caloric intake. The numbers shifted by fractions of a point, too dynamic to be old. Then he saw the label above the readings: Subject ID C. Matthews. The world tilted. He gripped the console to stay upright. His own body's data scrolled before his eyes, precise down to the minute. Every heartbeat, every breath recorded. The island hadn't simply watched him since the crash, it had been watching long before. Sensors buried in the sand, cameras disguised as stones, satellites overhead. It didn't matter. The result was the same. He had become the latest experiment in a program that should have died half a century ago. He forced himself to keep reading. Another window on the screen listed archived profiles, names, dates, durations, 9 subjects in total. The first entry began in 1969, the last in 2015. The list ended with his name and the date of his crash. The file path beside it read Observation Cycle, Ongoing. Beneath that, another message flickered, Observer override locked, remote access required. Whoever was running this place was still out there, somewhere beyond the horizon. He turned away from the screen, bile rising in his throat. On the far wall hung another map of the Caribbean, this one marked with red circles around several small islands. One was his. The others stretched in a line eastward, each labeled with an alphanumeric code. Argus wasn't one bunker, it was a network, scattered across the sea. At the bottom of the map, a handwritten note in faded ink read, Surveillance Field Continuity Permanent. He searched the desks for more documents and found folders stuffed with technical reports. Each was stamped CIA Behavioral Division, Psychological Operations Branch. The pages detailed test parameters for long-term isolation in controlled natural environments. Charts measured degradation of cognitive function over years of confinement. The cold, clinical language turned survival into experiment. He read until the words lost meaning. Subject conditioning, external interference, simulated rescue attempts. That last term stopped him. He flipped through the accompanying photographs. Grainy images showed other islands, other men, pilots, soldiers, engineers, standing beside wrecked aircraft and small fires on beaches. The captions read like entries in a scientific log. Subject 3 refuses to abandon site after 18 months. Subject 5 displays adaptive resilience. Subject 6 deceased following intervention phase. Each man looked unaware of the camera trained on him. Carter's vision blurred. His own memories replayed with horrifying clarity. The plane's sudden failure, the bottles with the future dates washing up on shore, the footprints in the sand. None of it had been coincidence. It had all been stimulus, data points in a design he had never agreed to. The crash, the isolation, even his father's disappearance. It was all connected. Argus didn't study accidents. It created them. He staggered back from the desk and nearly knocked over a metal stool. The noise echoed down the corridor. For a moment, he stood frozen, listening. Then, from somewhere deeper in the complex, a soft, mechanical sound stirred. Not the hum of the vents, not the buzz of old machinery. A rhythmic tapping, measured and deliberate. He turned off his flashlight and waited. The sound grew louder, closer, like footsteps on metal. Then it stopped. Silence again. He held his breath for nearly a minute before switching the light back on. The corridor behind him was empty. He forced himself to move. Panic would kill him faster than whatever still lived here. In the next room, he found rows of metal cabinets filled with files, each drawer labeled by year. Many were empty, their contents removed, but a few still held papers too fragile to touch. He sifted through them until a single folder caught his eye. The label read, Personnel, Operative Cabrera, Thomas, Active, 1980-1985. The name struck him like lightning. Cabrera, the same surname he had seen scrawled on the corner of one of the older logs. The same man mentioned in his father's letters as a trusted friend. Inside the folder were performance reports and medical evaluations. The last page carried a single line typed in bold, Subject promoted to field operative following successful containment of Subject 04. Below it, handwritten in red ink, was a later addition, Deserter. Attempted contact with Subject 09. Neutralized per protocol, Subject 09. His father. The paper trembled in his hands. The room seemed to shrink around him. His father had not vanished in an accident. He had tried to escape, to stop this, and they had killed him for it. Or worse, they had folded him back into the experiment until he ceased to be human at all. He shoved the papers back into the drawer and closed it quietly. There was nothing left to find here except ghosts. He retraced his steps through the corridor, back toward the main entry. As he neared the exit, the hum of the bunker deepened, a low, throbbing sound that made the floor vibrate under his boots. A red light blinked above the door. Then, suddenly, the same disembodied voice he had heard before filled the corridor. System integrity active. Subject observation resumed. The words repeated twice before cutting off. Carter didn't wait to hear them again. He sprinted toward the open door and stumbled into the daylight, gasping as if the sky itself had been withheld from him. The sun felt harsh and unreal on his skin. The sea stretched calm and silver to the horizon, indifferent to his discovery. He walked until his legs gave out, collapsing near the wreck of his plane. For hours he lay there, staring up at the sky, the wind tugging gently at his clothes. The patterns of clouds shifted overhead, forming shapes that reminded him of the faces in the photographs, the subjects, the watchers, his father. The line between them blurred until he no longer knew which he was. When darkness fell, he lit another fire and watched the flames struggle against the breeze. The photo of his father lay beside him, creased and smudged from his hands. He studied it under the flickering light, searching for clues he had missed before. At the bottom corner, he noticed faint writing that he had overlooked. 3 numbers, barely visible. 07-19-87. A date. The day his father's plane disappeared, and beneath it, another line, almost erased, Argus, Unit 9. He felt the weight of the island pressing down on him, the realization that his father had stood in this same place decades earlier, perhaps opening the same door, hearing the same voice. The experiment had never ended. It had simply evolved, passing from one generation to the next. He understood now why the bunker had recognized him, why the system had his biometric data. He was not an intruder here. He was the continuation of a design that began before his birth. The night deepened, the stars sharp and merciless. Somewhere in the cliffs, a light blinked once, as if signaling acknowledgement. Carter didn't move. He knew it wasn't imagination. The watchers were still here, behind the walls, behind the machines, patient as time itself. And he, the watched, sat in the glow of his own small fire, knowing that the story his father had tried to end had found a new subject. The hum beneath the island never stopped. It followed the rhythm of his heartbeat. It had been following him all his life. The wind on the island shifted after that night. It no longer carried the same salt-heavy stillness, but moved in short, nervous bursts, as though the air itself had become aware of being watched. Carter felt the change deep in his chest. Something had awakened beneath the ground, and the silence that followed was not absence. It was listening. He tried to ignore the sensation as he rebuilt his fire near dawn, but every flicker of flame seemed to echo back from the cliffs, like eyes reflecting light in the dark. He told himself he needed to think clearly, to act with the precision of the pilot he had once been, but clarity felt like a luxury now. The island was no longer a place. It was an organism, a system that breathed with him, through him. He returned to the bunker at first light. The decision was not bravery. It was inevitability. The revelation of the previous night had left him hollow but resolute. His father's death, the list of subjects, the data on the monitors, everything pointed toward a truth so large it could no longer remain buried. The world had to know. If Argus still existed beyond these cliffs, if others were trapped in its mirrored experiments, then silence made him complicit. He refused to be another subject who vanished into a logbook. The door opened as easily as before, as though the system recognized his intent. The hum of the generator pulsed beneath his boots, steady, confident. Lights flickered on in sequence down the corridor, guiding his steps like runway markers. The air inside felt colder, cleaner, almost sterile. It occurred to him that the bunker might be partially automated, running on deep cycle power cells that had been replaced periodically by remote drones or ships. Whoever operated this network had thought of everything. He walked back into the control room where his vital signs had been displayed on the monitor. The screen was still alive, lines of code scrolling slowly upward. His data streamed there. Heart rate, oxygen levels, temperature, continuing to update in real time. But now new text appeared beneath the graphs. External channel available. He stared at it, pulse quickening. It was the first sign of communication he had seen since the crash. The machine seemed to be offering him a way out, or perhaps another test. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. He sat before the console, hands trembling as he traced the worn keys of the keyboard. Most of the letters were faded, and the surface of the metal was cold. He typed a single word. "Hello?" The cursor blinked for several seconds before the reply appeared, stark and emotionless. "Identify?" He hesitated, then typed. "Carter Matthews, civilian pilot, crashed on the island 4 weeks ago." Another pause, then identity confirmed. Subject 10. He pushed back from the console as though struck. The numbering had advanced since his father. He was the next iteration, the next variable in a formula that had been running for decades. He stared at the screen, rage and disbelief battling inside him. "Who are you?" he typed. The response came instantly. Argus operational control, remote node active. Then, before he could reply, another line appeared. Observation compromised. Containment initiated. The words vanished, replaced by a loading bar. Somewhere deep in the bunker, machinery stirred. A heavy clang echoed down the corridor, followed by the slow grind of metal shifting against metal. He knew that sound, the sound of doors closing, containment. They were sealing him in. He ran, flashlight in hand, retracing his steps toward the exit. But when he reached the main passage, the outer door had already begun to slide shut. He threw his shoulder into it, straining against the weight. For a moment, it resisted, then stopped halfway, jammed by sand or corrosion. He slipped through the gap, scraping his side against the edge, and stumbled into the blinding daylight. Behind him, the door sealed with a final thud. The hum beneath the island deepened, the vibration crawling up through the soles of his boots. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of the beach. There, he collapsed onto the sand, panting, the sunlight too bright after the bunker's artificial gloom. The waves broke calmly, as though nothing had changed, but the island had begun to tremble with the slow pulse of machines waking. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. If the system considered him a security breach, it would remove him the same way it had removed the others. He spent the next hours scavenging what he could from the wreck: tools, a small solar battery, fragments of wiring. His mind worked with a pilot's discipline, methodical and detached, even as fear gnawed at the edges. He needed to send a signal strong enough to reach beyond the island's interference, something the Argus network couldn't immediately block. The emergency beacon built into his plane had burned out in the crash, but the transmitter unit still existed, buried deep inside the wreckage. He pried it free, its casing warped but intact. Setting up the rig took most of the afternoon. He carried it to the highest point on the island, a jagged ridge overlooking the cliffs. From there, he could see the endless horizon of the sea and the faint curvature of the earth. He mounted the antenna using a length of aluminum tubing and connected it to the salvaged solar cell. The wind tugged at the cables as he tightened them, whispering through the rusted holes in the metal. When he powered it up, the small indicator light blinked red, then amber. It was alive. He adjusted the frequency dial manually, cycling through emergency channels. Static filled the air, then a faint pulse of sound. He held his breath, tuning until the pulse became a steady rhythm. It wasn't a rescue beacon. It was the island's signal, the same frequency that had jammed his equipment before. Argus used it to mask transmissions, to create silence. He would have to fight it. He recalibrated the transmitter, narrowing the bandwidth and amplifying the output through the battery's surge. The light flickered, then steadied into green. He spoke into the microphone, voice rough from disuse. "This is Carter Matthews, civilian pilot, registration number N741JL. I have crash-landed on an uncharted island approximately 200 nautical miles south of Jamaica. The island contains a Cold War-era facility identified as Project Argus. The site is active. Repeat, the site is active. They are still here. Someone has to—" The line cut into static. He adjusted the dial again. "Find this place. Record everything. Tell them it never ended." He repeated the message 3 times, then switched to an automated loop. Each repetition drained more power from the battery, but he kept it running until the light dimmed. He wasn't sure if anyone could hear him, or if the signal would be swallowed by the Argus interference, but it didn't matter. The truth was out there now, somewhere in the invisible corridors of the airwaves. As dusk fell, the transmitter flickered and died. He sat beside it, staring out at the sea. For the first time since the crash, he felt something close to calm. He had broken the silence. Even if no one heard, even if the system erased every trace, he had spoken. He thought of his father, of the photograph and the inscription beneath it. Maybe the man had tried the same thing once, sending a message into the void, hoping someone would listen. The calm didn't last. When the first stars appeared, a light glowed briefly near the horizon, a pinpoint that moved against the darkness. He watched it grow larger, brighter, until he could make out the rhythmic flash of navigation lights. A plane or a drone, rescue or containment. He couldn't tell. His pulse quickened. He backed away from the ridge and made his way down to the beach, keeping to the shadows. The sound of rotors reached him faintly, a deep thrum that vibrated through the sand. The aircraft passed overhead, slow and deliberate, sweeping the island with a pale beam of light. He froze under a cluster of palms as it moved across the wreck and lingered there for several seconds. Then the beam shifted toward the cliffs. The door of the bunker gleamed briefly under the light, and the aircraft hovered, engines idling. Something small dropped from its underside, a black capsule trailing a line of smoke, and then it turned and flew off into the distance. The capsule hit the ground near the cliffs with a muffled thud. No explosion followed, only the faint hiss of gas escaping. Within minutes, a thin mist spread across the rocks, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Carter covered his mouth with his sleeve, retreating into the forest. The smell reached him even there. Acrid, synthetic, designed to cleanse. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were sterilizing the site. By dawn, the mist had dissipated, leaving behind a silence deeper than before. Birds had vanished. Even the insects were quiet. The air tasted of ash. He approached the cliffs cautiously, holding his breath as he neared the bunker. The metal door was streaked with residue, but otherwise unchanged. When he touched it, it was warm again, faintly vibrating. The system had survived whatever the gas was. Argus was still alive. He sat on the sand, exhausted. The transmitter lay dead on the ridge, the battery drained, but he didn't regret using it. Somewhere, someone might have caught the signal, a sliver of truth carried across the static. Maybe they would dismiss it as interference. Maybe they would trace it. Either way, it existed now. He opened his pack and pulled out a small waterproof case he had scavenged from the wreck. Inside were copies of the documents and photographs he had found in the bunker, proof of what lay beneath the island. He sealed the case again and walked to the northern end of the beach, where the cliffs split into a narrow gorge. There, he found a deep crevice hidden among the rocks. He wedged the case inside, wrapping it in layers of fabric and marking the spot with a symbol he scratched into the stone. A small triangle within a circle, the same emblem he had seen on his father's photo. If he didn't survive, someone might find it one day. If not, it would wait, just as the island had waited for him. The sun rose higher, burning away the last traces of mist. He sat watching it climb, his mind strangely clear. He knew the system would respond soon. Perhaps it already had, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The silence that surrounded him felt less like prison walls and more like the pause before an answer. He had done what his father could not. He had spoken to the world. Far out over the sea, a faint echo of engines stirred again, growing louder as it approached. He stood, staring into the horizon, wondering whether it was friend or enemy, rescue or erasure. The sound grew until it filled the air, vibrating through his bones. And as the shadow of the aircraft stretched across the beach toward him, Carter felt a strange peace settle over him, a certainty that whatever came next would not be the end, but the continuation of the message now carried by wind and static, a signal no machine could ever silence completely. The sound came first, a low mechanical hum that rolled across the horizon and deepened into a steady vibration that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. Carter raised his eyes to the sky, squinting into the glare of morning light, until the shape appeared against the blue. A helicopter, dark and angular, moving with the precision of a predator. It descended slowly, blades scattering salt mist from the sea. He stood motionless, caught between dread and hope, every instinct telling him to run, yet rooted to the spot by exhaustion and the faint, impossible wish that maybe someone had heard his message. The aircraft circled once, scanning the island with a steady beam of white light. When it settled onto the beach, the noise was deafening, the wind lashing his clothes and sending sand stinging across his face. Two figures emerged, silhouettes against the whirling blades. They moved with military discipline, their steps synchronized, their heads shielded by dark helmets that reflected the sun. No insignias, no visible rank. Carter's heart pounded. He wanted to shout, to demand who they were, but his throat had gone dry. One of them gestured for him to stay still, while the other scanned the surroundings with a handheld device. Then, through the noise came a voice, flat, controlled, distorted by the microphone. "Carter Matthews, you are safe now. We're taking you home." The words hung in the air, hollow as an echo. He wanted to believe them, but every instinct whispered otherwise. These men did not move like rescuers, they moved like containment officers. He remembered the bunker's message: observation compromised, containment initiated. This was not rescue. This was the final phase of the experiment. Still, he did not resist when they approached. One of them extended a gloved hand and pulled him toward the helicopter. The smell of disinfectant clung to their suits. Inside, the cabin was stripped of markings, lined with dark panels and rows of equipment humming softly. The door sealed behind them, shutting out the roar of the sea. The noise faded to a distant drone, and the vibration of the rotors became steady, hypnotic. Carter sank into a seat near the rear, staring at the floor. His body felt heavy, but his mind raced. He needed to think, to stay alert. Across from him sat a man who had not come out during the landing. He wasn't dressed like the others, no helmet, no armor, just a gray suit, immaculate despite the humidity. His face was clean-shaven, calm, almost kind. The man studied Carter for a long moment before speaking. "You've been through a lot, Captain Matthews. I'm glad we found you before the situation deteriorated further." His tone was smooth, practiced. He used Carter's old rank deliberately, as if reaching for something familiar to disarm him. Carter's voice came out rough. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "My name isn't important. What matters is that you're safe now. You'll be taken to a facility where we can evaluate your condition, help you recover from what you've experienced." Carter's gaze hardened. "You mean debrief me?" The man's smile didn't fade. "If you prefer that term. We're very interested in understanding how you survived. Most don't last this long." "Most?" The word came out sharper than he intended. The man leaned back, fingers intertwined. "Isolation can be destructive, but it can also reveal what's hidden. You adapted remarkably well. That's rare." Carter looked toward the window, but there was nothing to see, only the endless sweep of the ocean below. The island was already a shadow in the distance, shrinking, fading, until it vanished completely beneath a sheet of silver water. He felt a strange pull in his chest, as if something inside him were being left behind. The man continued speaking, his voice a calm drone. "You'll be taken to Panama first, then transferred to a secure medical center. There, specialists will assess your physical and psychological condition. Standard procedure." "Whose procedure?" Carter asked quietly. The man's eyes met his, unblinking. "The agency responsible for your rescue." It wasn't an answer, but Carter had already stopped expecting one. He turned his gaze inward, back to the sequence of events. The crash, the bunker, the documents, the photo of his father. They couldn't erase all of that. Somewhere inside the wreck, the evidence still waited, sealed in the rocks. They might destroy the island, but they couldn't unmake the truth. The helicopter's interior light shifted from white to a muted red. The man reached for a small case beside him and pulled out a syringe. "Sedative," he said. "You've been under extreme stress. You need rest before we land." Carter tensed. "I'm fine." "Please," the man said, his tone still gentle, "don't make this harder than it has to be." He stood, the syringe glinting faintly in the red light. The soldiers remained motionless, waiting. Carter weighed his chances. 3 against 1, no weapon, nowhere to run. He forced himself to relax. "Fine," he said, "but I want to stay awake until we reach land." The man nodded, satisfied. "As you wish." He placed the syringe back in the case and closed it carefully. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. You did the right thing sending that signal. It's important for people to know that some programs can't be shut down, but you should also understand they've already received your message, and they're not pleased. Carter froze. You intercepted it. We intercept everything, the man said simply. It's our job to control the narrative. You spoke into the void, Captain, but the void belongs to us. The words hit harder than a blow. For a moment, all sound faded. The hum of the rotors, the pulse of the engines, even the beating of his own heart. It was the same trap his father had fallen into. The illusion of freedom, of revelation, all part of the experiment. When the helicopter landed, the air was thick with humidity. They were no longer on the island, but somewhere along the coast, a small military airstrip surrounded by jungle. As they led him out, the smell of fuel and wet earth filled his lungs. Beyond the fence, a convoy of vehicles waited. The man in the gray suit walked ahead, gesturing calmly for Carter to follow. Inside one of the vehicles, the ride was silent, except for the low murmur of the engine. The landscape outside blurred, dense trees, flickering sunlight, then concrete walls topped with barbed wire. A checkpoint. Guards waved them through. The facility beyond was large but discreet, its architecture modern, sterile. No signs, no flags, just anonymity made of steel and glass. They took him to a small room with a bed, a table, and a window that didn't open. The man in the suit remained by the door. You'll have food and water soon. Someone will come for your statement in the morning. Carter looked at the reflection in the glass. Behind him, the man's outline was faint, distorted by the faint tint of the window. How long are you planning to keep me here? As long as it takes to understand what happened on that island. He wanted to laugh, but couldn't. You already know what happened. The man paused, then said softly, Knowing and understanding are different things. He opened the door. Try to sleep, Captain. When he left, Carter sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall opposite him. The hum of the air conditioning was the same frequency as the bunker's generators. Even here, the island followed him. The system had moved with him, invisible but alive. That night, he dreamed of his father, not as he remembered him, but as he had seen him in the photograph, young, proud, standing in front of the Argus insignia. The man in the dream reached out a hand, but said nothing. Behind him, the sea churned like liquid mercury. When Carter woke, his heart was racing. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a red light on the wall. For a moment, he thought it was an emergency indicator. Then he realized it was a camera. Days passed. He was questioned by men and women who introduced themselves only by their first names. They asked about the crash, about how he had survived, about the facility. He told them fragments, enough to appear cooperative, but not enough to reveal everything. He kept the details of the hidden drive, the case in the rocks, to himself. Trust was impossible here. At night, he could hear faint noises through the vents, voices, footsteps, the distant thrum of generators. Once, he woke to find a new scar on his arm, small but precise, as though someone had drawn blood while he slept. He began marking days on the wall with the edge of a coin he'd found under the bed, but after a while, he stopped. Time no longer meant anything. On the 10th day, the man in the gray suit returned. He carried a folder and placed it on the table without a word. Inside were photographs, his house, his wife, his son, all recent. The images made his stomach tighten. They're safe, the man said, for now, but you understand the importance of discretion. Carter looked up slowly. "You're threatening my family." "Protecting them," the man corrected. "From attention they don't need. From the consequences of your curiosity." Carter said nothing. The man closed the folder and straightened his tie. "You'll be released soon. We'll help you start again. A new identity, if you wish. No one needs to know where you've been." "And the others?" Carter asked. "The ones before me." The man paused at the door. "They served their purpose." When he left, Carter sat alone for a long time. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. He thought of the case hidden in the rocks, of the documents sealed in the dark. They couldn't bury everything, not forever. He had seen the pattern once and could see it again. There were always cracks, always traces. A week later, they let him go. No fanfare, no escort, just a flight back to the mainland and a warning not to talk to anyone. At the airport, he saw them before he saw his family. A man in a dark suit near the exit, another by the cafe pretending to read a newspaper. Their presence was quiet but unmistakable. The watchers had simply changed uniforms. Lucia met him at the gate. Her hair had more gray now, her eyes deeper lines of worry, but her arms were steady when she held him. Matteo stood behind her, taller than before, uncertain, watching his father as though meeting a stranger. They didn't speak much on the drive home. Words felt useless against the weight of years and secrets. That night, after Lucia and Matteo had gone to sleep, Carter sat by the window, listening to the distant hum of traffic. The city lights shimmered on the horizon, cold and indifferent. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the small memory drive he had hidden inside the lining before leaving the facility, a duplicate he'd made during one of his interrogations. It contained fragments of data, enough to prove the truth, enough to start something. He plugged it into his laptop and watched the screen flicker to life. Folders appeared, dates, images, transcripts. Among them was a file labeled Simmerman _Elog_final. He opened it. The text was brief, clinical. Subject 10, extraction successful. Behavioral patterns align with projection. Family integration phase initiated. Observation to continue remotely. He stared at the words until the screen blurred. Then he laughed softly, bitterly. The experiment hadn't ended at all. It had simply moved beyond the island, into his life, into his home. He turned off the laptop and looked out the window again. Across the street, a car idled with its lights off. A silhouette sat behind the wheel, unmoving. He didn't close the curtains. Let them watch. Let them record. He had already found a way to speak once. He would find another. The signal was still out there somewhere, bouncing between satellites and forgotten frequencies, carrying his voice into the static. And one day, someone would hear it. One day, the watchers would become the watched. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of ordinary life returned, at least on the surface. The sun rose through the thin curtains of the small house in Fort Lauderdale, and Carter awoke each morning to the smell of coffee and the distant sound of traffic. Lucia spoke softly as she moved about the kitchen, and Matteo, now 15, left early for school, his eyes darting between his parents as though trying to read something in their silence. The neighbors waved when Carter stepped outside, and the mail arrived every afternoon without fail. Everything looked normal, almost comfortingly so, but Carter knew better. Normalcy was an illusion, a well-crafted mask laid over the machinery of surveillance. Every hum of the refrigerator, every flicker of light in the hallway reminded him of the island's hidden systems. The experiment had changed locations, that was all. He tried to convince himself that the danger had passed. The man in the gray suit had promised peace if he kept quiet, and, for the sake of his family, he had agreed. But promises were just words, and Carter had learned to read the meaning between them. At night, when the house settled into silence, he could feel the weight of the unseen gaze pressing in through the walls. Sometimes a car idled across the street longer than it should have. Once, a drone passed overhead, its red light flickering like a heartbeat before vanishing into the clouds. The watchers had never left him. They had simply changed the tools they used. Lucia sensed the tension, though she said nothing. She moved through the days with the quiet patience of someone who had waited too long already. The nights were harder. She woke from dreams she couldn't explain, reaching for him in the dark. When she finally asked what had really happened on the island, he told her only fragments, that he had survived something engineered, that people had died, that the truth was bigger than both of them. Her eyes glistened in the dim light of the bedroom, but she didn't press further. Some truths, she seemed to understand, were too heavy to carry together. Carter spent his days pretending to rebuild. He met with former colleagues, found small repair jobs at a local airfield, and tried to keep his hands busy. But his mind was elsewhere, always circling back to the hidden drive, the data, the single word that haunted him like a curse, Argus. He couldn't let it end there. If he had learned anything from the island, it was that silence was the enemy. Someone had to expose what was buried, even if it meant becoming a ghost again. Late one night, after Lucia and Mateo had gone to sleep, he sat at his desk with the memory drive. He had already decrypted part of it, enough to know it contained not only his own data, but logs from other subjects. There were files marked Unit 7, Unit 11, Unit 12, each with names, dates, and coordinates. The scale was staggering. Dozens of islands scattered across the oceans, each a living laboratory. The logs were meticulous. Behavioral observations, health statistics, psychological notes, all written in the same cold, bureaucratic tone. But what stopped his breath were the more recent entries. Projects conducted long after the Cold War had ended, financed not by governments, but by corporations and private contractors. Argus had evolved into something even more insidious. He printed several pages, hiding them between the walls of his garage. The noise of the printer seemed deafening in the quiet house. When the ink ran out, he felt a flicker of panic, irrational but powerful, as though even the machine knew what he was doing. He turned off the lights, waiting for the sound of footsteps that didn't come. Outside, the street was empty, the night still. Only when he exhaled did he realize he'd been holding his breath for nearly a minute. The next morning, a letter arrived with no return address. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single photograph, him and his family, taken from across the street. On the back, in clean, typed letters, were 4 words: "Don't make the same mistake." He burned it in the sink, watching the image curl and blacken, but the warning lingered in his mind like a splinter. He should have stopped. He knew it. Yet every attempt to bury the truth only drove him deeper into it. He began visiting the public library, using their computers instead of his own. He sent encrypted emails under false names to journalists, attaching fragments of the data and offering to meet anonymously. Weeks passed without response. Either the messages were intercepted or the recipients were already dead. He switched to other methods: burner phones, letters, hidden messages on online forums. Each attempt dissolved into silence. Argus had its hands in everything. One evening, Matteo came into his workshop unannounced. Carter quickly covered the papers on the table, but the boy had already seen too much. "You're still working on it," he said quietly. "The island." His voice carried more curiosity than accusation, but his eyes were sharp. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "There are things people need to know." "They won't let you," Matteo said simply. It wasn't fear in his tone. It was certainty, the weary knowledge of someone who had grown up in the shadow of secrets. "I see them sometimes. Same car outside, same people at the store. Mom pretends not to notice, but she does." Carter reached out, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "You have to stay away from this. Promise me. If anything happens, I'm not leaving," Matteo interrupted. His jaw set in a way that reminded Carter painfully of himself at that age. The boy left without another word. That night, Carter couldn't sleep. He dreamed of the island again, of the door opening into darkness, of the machines humming beneath the ground. When he woke, dawn was bleeding through the blinds, and the distant cry of a seagull pulled him back to the present. He sat up slowly and realized that something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Lucia's side of the bed was empty, but that was normal. She often woke early. Matteo's door, however, was open, his room empty. On the desk, a note written in hurried pencil. "I need to know what they did to you." Panic seized him. He ran outside, scanning the street. The car that usually lingered there was gone. He checked the garage, the tools, the secret compartment in the wall, all untouched. Then he noticed the laptop still on the table, its screen glowing faintly. A message window was open, a chat log displaying lines of text between Matteo and an unknown contact. The last message, timestamped at 3:14 a.m., read, "We know where the island is. We can help." The air left his lungs. He scrolled back, but most of the earlier conversation had been deleted. His hands shook as he grabbed his jacket and keys. He had to find his son before they did. Hours later, he was driving down the coastal highway, the ocean flashing silver beside him. The coordinates in the chat pointed toward a small marina 2 hours south, a place he recognized from his early flying routes. He could barely think, his mind a blur of fear and guilt. He had brought the danger home, and now it was claiming the only thing that mattered more than truth. When he reached the marina, the docks were nearly empty. Fishing boats swayed gently in the water, and the smell of diesel hung heavy in the air. He searched each pier, calling Matteo's name, but only the gulls answered. Then, at the far end of the dock, he saw it. A small motorboat, engine running, untethered and drifting slowly away from the pier. On its deck sat a backpack and a folded note weighed down by a wrench. Carter ran, jumping into the boat and pulling it back with the rope. The note was short, written in Matteo's handwriting. "I'm with them. They said they can prove everything. I'll bring back the truth." Beneath the message was a symbol, a triangle inside a circle. His father's mark. He stood there, the paper trembling in his hands as realization spread like ice through his veins. Matteo hadn't been taken. He had gone willingly, drawn by the same need for answers that had consumed his father and now him. The circle had closed again. Argus didn't need to hunt them. It only had to wait. By the time he started the boat, the trail was already fading. The water stretched endless and indifferent, mirroring the pale morning sky. He pushed the throttle, guiding the vessel toward the open sea. Somewhere out there lay the island, or what remained of it. Maybe it had been erased from maps. Maybe it had been rebuilt. He didn't know, but he could feel it, the way one feels a phantom limb. As hours passed, the coastline vanished behind him. Clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and gray. The sea darkened, the wind rising. He thought of the chain of fathers and sons bound by secrets, of experiments stretching across generations. Argus had always been more than a project. It was an idea, a belief that humanity could be studied, shaped, controlled, and every time someone tried to destroy it, it adapted, moved forward, wearing a new face. By evening, the storm broke. Rain hammered the deck, and waves slammed against the hull. He gripped the wheel, vision blurred by salt and water. Lightning flashed, and for a split second he saw something ahead, a faint silhouette rising from the sea. An island, or what looked like one. He pushed forward, the engine straining against the current. When he finally reached the shallows, he jumped into the water, dragging the boat to shore. The beach was narrow, scattered with dark stones. The sky above burned with the last light of the dying storm. He took a step forward and froze. In the sand lay a rusted metal plate, half buried by the tide. The letters were almost unreadable, but he traced them with his fingers until the name emerged, Argus Unit 11. His heart stopped. This wasn't his island. It was another, one of the many. The project had spread further than he could ever have imagined, and somewhere, perhaps on another shore, his son was walking into the same trap, guided by promises of truth. Carter sank to his knees, rain washing over him. The sea roared behind him like a vast machine, endless and ancient. He understood now that the experiment had no boundaries, no end. It lived in the watchers and the watched, in the need to uncover and the fear of being seen. Argus was the mirror humanity kept building for itself, a reflection it could neither face nor destroy. He looked once more toward the horizon, where lightning flickered faintly in the clouds and whispered his son's name into the wind. The ocean swallowed the sound. Then he rose, eyes fixed on the jungle that waited beyond the beach. Somewhere inside those trees, machines were still humming, and the legacy of silence continued. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that the only way to end it was to enter it once more, to become, willingly this time, the final subject. If you were captivated by this story, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We have more unbelievable true-style stories waiting for you, each one more shocking than the last dot. Click subscribe. Turn on notifications and watch the next video right now to uncover the rest of the mystery dot. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let's see how many of them can handle the truth behind what really happened.